You've probably seen him before. He's one of the most recognizable figures in all of Chinese history. You know the statues, that intense red face, the super long beard, holding a massive weapon. He just screams loyalty and power. But the real story of Guan Yu, the guy who actually became a god, oh, it's so much more complicated and honestly, way more interesting than any statue can show.
When you picture Guan Yu, this is probably what comes to mind, right? The god of war, a powerful, totally righteous deity with that iconic look, wielding his legendary green dragon crescent blade. He is the poster boy for an invincible warrior, the absolute symbol of martial might. And it's not just about fighting. He stands for some of the biggest virtues you can think of in Chinese culture. We're talking unbreakable loyalty, a rock-solid code of honor, and this sacred idea of brotherhood. These are the pillars of his whole legend. It's why people don't just admire him, they worship him. Okay, but here's where the story takes a turn. What if I told you the real man, the historical guy behind the myth, wasn't just imperfect, he was deeply, deeply flawed? What if the actual historical records show a brilliant warrior who was also so arrogant, so full of himself, that it directly caused his own humiliating downfall and execution? So that's the puzzle we're going to piece together. We're going to follow this incredible journey of how a very human, very flawed general was slowly transformed over hundreds of years into one of the most famous gods in the world. To really get the god, you have to meet the hero first. And that hero? Well, he was pretty much created by this epic 14th century novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. This book is what took the historical figure and just cranked his legend up to 11. And the novel kicks off with maybe the most foundational myth of all, the Oath of the Peach Garden. This is where Guan Yu swears to be brothers forever with his lord, Liu Bei, and the fierce warrior Zhang Fei. This one moment defines his entire character in the story. His loyalty is absolute. It's a bond that can never, ever be broken. From there, the book just gives him this superhuman highlight reel. I mean, you've got this scene where he kills a top enemy general before a cup of wine is time to cool down. Then there's the time he rides completely alone across enemy lands, cutting down 6 different generals who try to stop him. He even lets his arch-nemesis Cao Cao escape, all because his personal code of honor demanded it. And maybe the most legendary story of all, he plays a game of Go, totally calm, while a doctor is literally scraping poison out of his arm bone. The novel paints this picture of a perfect, flawless hero. All right, so that's the legend. Awesome story. But what about the man? Well, if you go back to the actual historical texts, like the records of the Three Kingdoms, written more than 1,000 years earlier, you get a very, very different picture. A picture of a man who was brilliant, for sure, but also deeply flawed. And this really gets to the heart of the real Guan Yu. On one side, his loyalty was absolutely the real deal. It was legendary even while he was alive. He famously walked away from tons of money and a high-ranking position just to rejoin his old boss who was on the run. But that incredible virtue was paired with a fatal arrogance. He was notorious for looking down on his own colleagues, for insulting his allies, and that attitude is exactly what would bring him down. And listen, this isn't just us looking back and judging him. This was the official historical take on the guy. The historian Chen Shou used this specific phrase, Gong Er Jin, to describe Guan Yu's main problem. It basically means he was arrogant and full of himself, and the historian straight up said this flaw was the reason he ultimately failed. You want to know how famous his ego was? Get this. A new star general, Ma Chao, joins their side. Guan Yu, who's hundreds of miles away on the front lines, hears about it and immediately writes a letter to the head strategist, Zhu Liang. The letter pretty much says, "So, is this new guy as good as me?" Zhu Liang, who is a genius at handling people, had to write back this incredibly flattering letter calling Guan Yu's elegance peerless, just to manage his ego and keep him from getting angry. So now that we know about this more complicated, flawed guy, let's circle back to those greatest hits from the novel. How many of those incredible stories actually happened? And which ones were just good storytelling? Okay, this part is just so cool. That famous Oath of the Peach Garden? Yeah, that was made up. They were close, but no oath. Riding alone and killing 6 generals? Total fiction. In reality, nobody even tried to stop him. Releasing Cao Cao at Huarong Pass? Nope, never happened. But, and this is a huge but, some of his most amazing feats were 100% real.
He really did charge into a massive enemy army, behead their top general, Liang, and just ride out with the head. And his greatest strategic moment, using a flood to wipe out an entire enemy army at Fancheng, totally real. That victory, the records say, shook China.
So just think about that for a second. At the very peak of his power, right after that stunning victory at Fancheng, Guan Yu looked unstoppable. You'd think it would take an even bigger army to bring him down. But it didn't. His downfall wasn't because of a better general or a stronger enemy. No. He was defeated by himself.
This right here, this is the moment it all fell apart. His most important ally, the warlord Sun Quan, suggested a political marriage. His son would marry Guan Yu's daughter. It was a standard move to solidify their alliance. Guan Yu's response? He didn't just say no. He publicly, viciously insulted him. He asked, "How can my tiger's daughter marry a dog's son?" In one sentence, he turned his most vital ally into a bitter enemy.
And that one insult started a catastrophic chain of events. So first, he pushes away his ally. At the same time, he's also treating his own officers badly, threatening them. So what happens next? The ally he just insulted, Sun Quan, launches a secret invasion of Guan Yu's home base. And because Guan Yu had treated his own officers so poorly, they just defected. They surrendered without even putting up a fight. When Guan Yu's soldiers on the front line heard that their homes and families had been captured, the army just dissolved. And just like that, he was isolated, captured, and executed. A complete collapse, all because of his own arrogance. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. If the real Guan Yu was a flawed general who died in such a humiliating defeat, how in the world did he become a perfect, invincible god? Well, it definitely didn't happen overnight. It was this slow, gradual process that took over 1,500 years. First, he was just a folk hero. Then Buddhism adopted him as a kind of fierce temple guardian. After that, emperors started to see how useful his image could be. During the Song dynasty, when they were fighting invaders from the north, they promoted Guan Yu as the perfect, loyal soldier. Then, of course, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel came along and cemented that perfect hero image for everyone. And finally, the Qing dynasty emperors elevated him to the status of a god, putting him on the same level as Confucius, the sage of culture. He became the martial sage. And today, his fan club is just staggering. I mean, he's a guardian deity in Buddhist and Taoist temples. But get this, he's worshipped as the god of brotherhood and loyalty by both the police and, ironically, the triads. And because that kind of integrity is seen as good for business, he's also a hugely popular god of wealth. You'll see his statue in shops and restaurants all over the globe. So in the end, this general, who failed so spectacularly in life, achieved a level of success in death that's almost unmatched. He went from a tragic figure to a cultural icon to a literal god. His story really proves that an idea, in his case the idea of perfect loyalty, can become way more powerful than the flawed person who started it all. Which really leaves us with one last thing to think about. Guan Yu's journey shows us that history isn't just about what happened. It's about the stories we decide to tell and the heroes we choose to build. And it makes you wonder, right? What virtues are so important to us that we're willing to take a flawed human being and polish them into a perfect god?